Bitter winds howled through the San Juan Mountains, carrying whispers of a secret buried beneath deep powder. High on Miller's Ridge, a solitary hunter stumbled upon an impossible sight, smoke rising from a cursed abandoned cabin. Inside was a woman the cruel world had cast aside, fighting a solitary war against the freezing cold. What happened next between this rugged frontiersman and the fiercely resilient outcast defied every expectation. This is a story of survival, hidden pasts, and an astonishing twist of fate. Winter in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado was not merely a season, it was an apex predator. By November of 1888, the snowpack near the mining town of Silverton was already deep enough to swallow a horse whole. Up on the jagged slopes of Miller's Ridge, elevation 9,000 feet, the air was so thin and frigid it burned the lungs with every drawn breath. It was a place where only wolves, grizzly bears, and ghosts lingered. And Henry Halloway. Henry was a man carved from the very granite of the peaks he called home. Standing 6'3" in his moccasins, wrapped in a heavy coat of cured bear hide, he moved through the waist-deep snowdrifts with the silent rolling gait of a seasoned predator. He had spent the last decade isolating himself from the so-called civilized world. The memories of the chaotic, crowded streets of Denver and the bloodshed he had witnessed out east had driven him to the quiet mercy of the wilderness. He survived by running a trap line, hunting elk, and trading pelts, only when absolutely necessary at a secluded outpost miles from town. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, the sky was a bruised, heavy purple, threatening a fresh deluge of snow. Henry was tracking a wounded mule deer, his Sharps rifle resting easily across his forearms, his eyes reading the indentations as the powder like an open book. Then he stopped. His nostrils flared. Beneath the sharp, sterile scent of pine and ozone, there was something undeniably out of place. Wood smoke, and not the clean burn of dry timber, but the sputtering, acrid stench of wet green wood. Henry lowered his rifle, his brow furrowing beneath the brim of his fur cap. The wind was blowing down from the north, directly from the site of Old Man Miller's cabin. The structure had been abandoned for 6 years, ever since Miller had succumbed to frostbite during the brutal freeze of '82. The roof was half caved in, the chinking between the logs rotted away. No sane prospector or trapper would ever use it for shelter. Claim jumpers and outlaws usually avoided it entirely, believing the place to be cursed by Miller's lonely ghost. Silently, Henry adjusted his ashwood snowshoes and altered his course. As he crested the final snowbank, the dilapidated cabin came into view. The sight of it made Henry's jaw tighten. Someone was indeed there. A pathetic, thin ribbon of gray smoke was struggling to escape the crumbling stone chimney. But what caught his immediate attention was the figure in the front yard. It was not a hardened outlaw, nor a lost prospector. It was a woman. Henry knelt behind the trunk of a massive ponderosa pine, remaining perfectly still as he observed her. She was a woman of considerable size, her heavy, rotund frame bundled in an absurd assortment of ill-fitting woolen coats and a tattered men's slicker that barely buttoned across her chest. In the genteel parlors of Denver or Chicago, a woman of her obese stature would have been the target of cruel whispers, hidden away by embarrassed relatives or mocked by potential suitors. Out here, her size was a stark contrast to the hollowed-out, starved frames of typical mountain drifters. Yet, any assumptions about her physical condition were quickly shattered by the raw, desperate labor she was attempting. Her name was Clara Higgins, though Henry did not know that yet. She was wielding a rusted, dull axe, swinging it at a frozen stump of green pine with a ferocity born entirely of panic. Thwack! The axe bounced off the frozen wood, the vibration jarring her arm so violently that Henry winced in sympathy. Clara gasped for air, her breath pluming in thick white clouds. Her face was flushed a dangerous crimson, her chestnut hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, despite the sub-zero temperatures. She adjusted her grip with bare, blistered hands. She had no gloves. Henry's survival instincts instantly tallied the fatal errors happening before his eyes. The wood. She was trying to burn unseasoned frozen pine. It would produce smoke but no real heat. The shelter. The cabin's door was hanging by a single leather hinge, letting the mountain wind cut right through the interior. The exertion. She was sweating. In the deep mountains, sweat was a death sentence. Once she stopped moving, that moisture would freeze against her skin, plunging her into hypothermia within the hour. She swung again. The axe slipped, grazing her heavy skirt and embedding itself into the snow. Clara let out a frustrated, choked sob, falling to her knees in the deep powder. She wrapped her ungloved hands beneath her armpits, her large shoulders shaking uncontrollably. She looked utterly defeated, an outcast pushed to the very edge of the earth, waiting for the cold to finally take her. Henry had sworn off people. He had promised himself he would never again entangle his life in the messy, tragic affairs of humanity. He was supposed to turn around, track his deer, and return to his own warm, well-stocked cabin. But as he watched the large, shivering woman desperately trying to pull the heavy axe from the snow, a profound sense of respect flickered in his chest. She was completely out of her depth, entirely unsuited for this brutal landscape. Yet she was fighting. She wasn't lying down to die. She was fighting for her life, with every ounce of mass and muscle she possessed. Henry engaged the safety on his rifle, slung it over his shoulder, and stepped out from the tree line. The crunch of Henry's snowshoes broke the eerie silence of the clearing. Clara's head snapped up. Her eyes, a striking shade of pale hazel, went wide with sheer terror. She scrambled backward in the snow, her heavy boots slipping, kicking up a flurry of white powder. To her, Henry must have looked like a monster born of the mountains, a hulking, broad-shouldered giant draped in animal skins, his face obscured by a thick, dark beard and the shadows of the falling evening. "Stay back!" Clara cried out, her voice hoarse but surprisingly commanding. She grabbed the handle of the rusted axe, managing to wrench it from the snowdrift, holding it up like a weapon despite her trembling hands. Henry stopped immediately. He was 10 yards away, well out of striking distance, but he recognized the look of a cornered animal. He slowly raised both of his large hands, palms facing outward, showing he meant no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you, ma'am," Henry said. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, rough from years of disuse, but calm and steady. "But if you keep swinging that dull iron at frozen greenwood, you're going to break your wrists or freeze to death, likely both." Clara kept the axe raised, her chest heaving as she assessed him. She was accustomed to men looking at her with either pity, disgust, or cruel amusement. Back in Denver, they called her the Higgins Mountain, a cruel joke regarding her weight. But this man's eyes, a piercing, icy blue, held no mockery. They swept over her form with clinical precision, assessing her cold-weather gear, her blistered hands, and her immediate physical state without an ounce of judgment. "I can manage," Clara said stubbornly, though her teeth were chattering so violently she nearly bit her tongue. "No, ma'am, you can't," Henry replied simply, stating a fact rather than an insult. Slowly, deliberately, he unslung his rifle and leaned it against a nearby rock. He unbuckled his heavy gun belt, leaving his Colt revolver beside the rifle. Completely unarmed, he stepped forward again. Clara's grip on the axe faltered. The sheer exhaustion was setting in, her muscles screaming in agony. As Henry closed the distance, she realized how truly massive he was, dwarfing even her own substantial frame. He stopped right in front of her and gently extended a hand wrapped in a thick leather gauntlet. "Let me," he said softly. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling wind tearing through the pine needles. Clara looked into his eyes, searching for a trap, for the familiar gleam of a cruel trick. She found nothing but quiet certainty. Slowly, her frozen, blistered fingers uncurled from the hickory handle. Henry took the axe. He tested the weight of it, ran a gloved thumb over the blunt edge, and sighed. He turned his back to her, a deliberate show of trust, and walked over to the woodpile. He didn't bother with the frozen green pine she had been hacking at. Instead, He trudged over to the side of the cabin, kicking away 2 feet of snow to reveal the lower logs of an old collapsed lean-to. The wood was dead, dry, and seasoned by years of wind and sun. With smooth, terrifyingly powerful strikes, Henry began to chop. The dull axe, which had bounced off the wood for Clara, bit deep under his immense strength. Within 10 minutes, he had reduced the dry logs to a massive pile of perfectly split kindling and firewood. Clara stood by the doorway, her arms wrapped around her wide waist, watching in stunned silence. She was deeply self-conscious, hyper-aware of how she must look, a massive, unkempt woman hiding in a ruined cabin. She waited for the inevitable comment. The joke about how she had enough insulation to survive the winter, or a snide remark about how a woman of her size shouldn't be out playing frontiersman. The comment never came. Henry gathered a massive armful of the dry wood and walked past her into the cabin. He didn't ask for permission, and Clara was too cold to protest. She followed him inside. The interior of Old Man Miller's cabin was a nightmare. The floorboards were rotting, the air smelled of mildew and stale dirt, and the hearth was choking on thick black smoke from the wet pine. Henry dropped the dry wood on the stone floor. He knelt, using a heavy iron poker to clear out the wet logs, replacing them with the dry kindling he had chopped. Within minutes, a bright, roaring fire blazed to life, immediately pushing back the oppressive chill of the room. He stood up and turned to Clara. She was hovering near the door, her large frame shaking. "Take off the outer coat," Henry instructed. Clara stiffened, her cheeks burning with a fresh wave of humiliation and defense. "I will do no such thing." "Ma'am, you are sweating," Henry said, his tone perfectly level, devoid of any inappropriate undertone. "Your outer coat is soaked with melted snow and perspiration. In this altitude, damp clothing will draw the heat straight out of your core. You have enough fortitude to endure the cold better than a rail-thin prospector, but wet wool will kill anyone. Take it off, hang it by the fire, and sit down." Clara stared at him, taken aback by his blunt, pragmatic observation of her size. He didn't say it as an insult. He said it as a simple fact of wilderness survival. The realization disarmed her. With trembling fingers, she unbuttoned the soaked men's slicker and let it fall to the floor, leaving her in a heavy woolen dress. She moved toward the fire, sinking heavily into a sturdy wooden crate. The heat washed over her face, and for the first time in 3 days, she felt her toes. Henry reached into the large canvas satchel he carried over his shoulder. He pulled out a large, butchered hindquarter of a mountain hare, wrapped in wax paper, and set it on the small, dusty table. Next to it, he placed a small pouch of salt and a tin of tea leaves. "I'll come back tomorrow to fix that door hinge," Henry said, adjusting his bare hide coat and moving toward the exit. "Don't burn the wet wood until the fire's hot enough to dry it out first." "Wait!" Clara called out, her voice cracking. Henry paused in the doorway, the freezing wind whipping his beard. "Why?" Clara asked, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." Henry looked back at her. He saw a woman society had undoubtedly cast aside, a woman who had fled whatever life she knew to face a near-certain death in the Rockies rather than stay in her circumstances. He respected that kind of grit. "Because out here, ma'am, the mountains don't care who you were down below," Henry said softly. "They only care if you're willing to fight to see tomorrow. You were fighting. I figure that earns you a fire." Without another word, Henry stepped out into the twilight, leaving Clara Higgins alone with the warmth, the food, and a sudden, overwhelming sense of hope. 3 days passed. True to his word, Henry Halloway returned to Miller's Ridge. He didn't crowd Clara or demand conversation. He was a phantom of practical salvation. On Wednesday, he arrived with a pouch of heavy iron nails and a hammer, fixing the broken leather hinge on the heavy oak door so it shut tight against the howling wind. On Thursday, he brought 2 heavy woolen blankets and a pair of thick, fur-lined mittens that fit her large hands perfectly. Clara began to anticipate his arrivals. The deep, agonizing loneliness that had chased her from Denver began to recede, replaced by the quiet comfort of the mountain man's silent presence. She cooked the hare he provided, making a rich, hearty stew. When he arrived to fix the roof chinking on Thursday afternoon, she stubbornly insisted he sit and eat with her. He did, eating with the quiet, ravenous efficiency of a man used to surviving on trail rations. They spoke little. Henry learned her first name, Clara, but did not pry into her surname or her reasons for being in an abandoned cabin 50 miles from civilization. Clara learned that Henry was a veteran of the horrific battles of Shiloh and Antietam, though he spoke of the war in vague, shadowy terms. They were two massive, bruised souls, finding an unspoken rhythm in the harshest environment in America. But the mountains were entirely indifferent to their burgeoning truce. By Friday morning, the atmospheric pressure in the San Juans plummeted so rapidly it made Henry's ears pop. Back at his own cabin, 5 miles higher up the valley, Henry stepped out onto his porch and looked at the sky. It was no longer purple. It was a sickly, pale yellow, almost identical to the color of a bruised plum fading into jaundice. The wind had stopped completely. The silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Henry's blood ran cold. The old-timers in the Rockies called it the white breath. It was the precursor to a localized, catastrophic blizzard, the kind of storm that buried whole mining camps and froze livestock solid in their barns. Later in history, it would be remembered as part of the Great White Hurricane of '88, a weather anomaly that tore across the frontier. He looked down the valley toward Miller's Ridge. His cabin was reinforced, stocked with 3 cords of wood and enough salted meat to last until spring. Claire was in a rotted shack with a repaired door and a few days' worth of kindling. "Damn it," Henry muttered. He didn't think twice. He grabbed his heavy canvas packs, stuffing them with extra provisions, hardtack, coffee, dried venison, and a heavy iron Dutch oven. He saddled his foul-tempered but incredibly sturdy pack mule, Barnaby, and threw the packs over the saddle. The descent toward Miller's Ridge was a race against the sky. The temperature was dropping by the minute. By the time Henry was halfway there, the first snowflakes began to fall, not drifting, but driving downward like tiny frozen needles. The wind woke up, shrieking through the canyons with a deafening roar. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Henry walked ahead of Barnaby, using his massive frame to break the wind for the mule, navigating purely by instinct and memory of the terrain. The snow deepened rapidly, pulling at his legs like cold mud. When he finally crashed through the tree line into Clara's clearing, the blizzard had fully unleashed its fury. The cabin was barely visible through the blinding wall of white. Henry hammered on the thick oak door. "Clara, open up!" The door flew open, the wind immediately trying to tear it off its newly repaired hinges. Clara stood there, bundled in her blankets, her face pale with terror. Henry didn't hesitate. He pulled Barnaby by the halter, dragging the stubborn mule right through the front door of the cabin and into the small attached storage antechamber. Out here, leaving the animal outside was a death sentence, and Henry wasn't about to lose his only transport. He slammed the cabin door shut, dropping the heavy wooden crossbar into place. The sudden absence of the wind's full force was jarring, though the cabin groaned and rattled violently under the assault. Clara was staring at him, her chest heaving, eyes wide. "What is happening?" "A white hurricane," Henry breathed, shaking a layer of snow from his bare hide coat. He looked around the dim cabin. The fire was burning, but it wasn't enough. The temperature inside was already plunging as the wind forced freezing air through the decaying chinking in the walls. "We need to seal the gap," Henry barked, moving with sudden, intense energy. "Tear up the old floorboards in the corner. Stuff the cracks with anything. Dirt, old rags, moss from the logs. If we don't block the drafts, we'll freeze to death by midnight." For the next 2 hours, they worked in frantic tandem. The shared proximity forced a breaking of boundaries. Clara, utilizing her substantial weight and strength, ripped up loose, rotted floorboards to expose the semi-frozen earth beneath. They packed mud and snow into the gaps of the logs. The physical exertion warmed them, but the fear of the screaming storm outside kept their adrenaline spiking. By nightfall, they had done all they could. The cabin was sealed as best as possible. The fire was roaring, built up with the last of Henry's dry wood. They sat on the floor near the hearth, exhausted, their backs resting against the heavy wooden table. The storm outside sounded like a freight train eternally passing over the roof. Clara was shivering, despite the heat of the fire. The sheer terror of the storm was sinking in. Henry noticed her trembling. Without a word, he unclasped his massive bear hide coat and draped it over her broad shoulders. The heavy fur engulfed her, radiating the warmth of his body. "Thank you," Clara whispered, pulling the fur tight around her neck. "You did good today, Clara," Henry said, staring into the flames. "Most folks would have panicked. You held your own." A sad, bitter smile touched her lips. "I've had a lot of practice surviving things that try to break me." Henry looked at her, truly looking. In the flickering firelight, her face held a striking, unconventional beauty. Strong jaw, intelligent eyes, a canvas of survival. "Why are you out here, Clara? This isn't a place for someone running away without a plan." Clara tightened her grip on the coat. She leaned forward, and as she did, her foot brushed against the heavy leather satchel she had kept hidden beneath her makeshift bed. The movement knocked the satchel over. It spilled onto the uneven floorboards. Henry's eyes instantly tracked the movement. Out of the bag tumbled a few articles of fine silk clothing, entirely out of place in the mountains, along with a heavy gold-plated Derringer pistol. But it was the third item that made the blood freeze in Henry's veins. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger. The cover was embossed with heavy gold lettering that caught the firelight perfectly. Josiah Crane, Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, private accounts. Henry's breath hitched. His massive hand shot out, grabbing the ledger before Clara could snatch it back. He stared at the name, the letters burning into his retinas. Josiah Crane, the ruthless railroad baron of Denver, the man who orchestrated land grabs through intimidation and murder, the very man whose hired thugs had burned down Henry's family homestead in Kansas 10 years ago, killing his brother and driving Henry into the mountains with a vow of blood vengeance he had never been able to fulfill. Henry slowly looked up from the ledger, his icy blue eyes locking onto Clara. The warmth and camaraderie of the last few hours vanished, replaced by the dangerous, predatory stillness of the mountain man she had first met. "Where?" Henry asked, his voice a low, lethal whisper that cut through the roaring of the storm outside. "Did you get this book?" Clara shrank back, her heart hammering against her ribs, realizing that the one man who had shown her kindness might just be the very danger she had been running from all along. The silence inside the cabin was heavier than the snow burying its roof. The wind shrieked and battered the logs, but between Henry and Clara, the air had gone dead and still. Henry's thumb traced the embossed gold lettering of the ledger. His knuckles were white. The tendons in his massive forearms pulled taut as bridge cables. The phantom smell of burning Kansas prairie filled his nose, overriding the scent of wood smoke. 10 years of suppressed grief and blistering rage coalesced into a single terrifying glare, directed at the woman cowering before him. "I will ask you one last time." Henry's voice was a dangerous, rumbling baritone. "How do you possess Josiah Crane's private ledger? Are you one of his spies, his whores?" Clara flinched at the venom in his words, but the sheer insult sparked something deep within her. The terror that had initially seized her melted into a fierce, indignant fire. She had not survived the agonizing trek up this mountain just to be bullied by another man, even one who had saved her life. She pushed herself up from the floor, drawing her large frame to its full, imposing height. She pulled the bear hide coat tighter around her shoulders like royal armor. "I am neither his spy nor his whore," Clara spat, her hazel eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "I am his wife. I am Clara Crane." Henry froze. The name hit him like a physical blow. Josiah Crane's wife. The wife of the man who had ordered his brother Thomas shot dead in the dirt over a disputed right-of-way. Henry's hand dropped instinctively to the heavy hunting knife sheathed at his hip. "You're lying," Henry growled, taking a slow step forward. "Josiah Crane is married to a Denver socialite, a woman draped in diamonds, paraded around the opera houses and the governor's galas. I've read the society papers." "You read about his mistresses," Clara corrected bitterly, a hollow, humorless laugh escaping her lips. You read about the women he uses to buy influence. He keeps his legal wife locked away in a sprawling estate in Cherry Creek, out of sight from his high society friends, because a man of his stature cannot be seen with a woman who looks like a prized heifer. She gestured down at her own heavy, rotund frame, the self-deprecation masking a profound reservoir of pain. My father was Henry Higgins, a wealthy mercantile baron. Josiah didn't want a wife. He wanted my father's shipping empire and his capital to fund his railroad expansion. He married me, waited for my father to die of consumption, and then took everything. Once he had the money, he cast me into a back room of his mansion. I was a prisoner, Mr. Halloway, fed, clothed, and utterly erased from the world. Henry's grip on the knife loosened slightly. He studied her face in the flickering firelight. There was no deception there, only the raw, bleeding edge of a woman who had been systematically dismantled by a monster. If you were a prisoner, Henry said, his voice lowering, the predatory edge softening into cautious curiosity, how do you have his private accounts? Clara lifted her chin, a spark of pure defiance in her eyes. Because Josiah Crane is an arrogant fool. He assumed that because I am fat, I must also be stupid. But I was my father's daughter. I understand numbers. I understand commerce. When Josiah's accountants couldn't balance his illegal kickbacks, land thefts, and payouts to hired guns, I sneaked into his study at night. I found this ledger. She pointed a trembling finger at the book in Henry's hand. That book, Clara continued, her breath coming faster, contains the names, dates, and amounts of every bribe he paid to federal judges. It contains the bounties he placed on the heads of homesteaders who refused to sell their land. It is the rope that will hang him. I stole it, and I ran. Henry looked down at the ledger. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with meticulous, cramped handwriting. He flipped to the year 1878. He scanned the columns until his finger stopped on a specific entry marked in red ink. May 14th, 1878. Payout, $500. Task, cleared Halloway Tract, Kansas. Henry's breath hitched. $500. That was the price of his brother's life. That was the value Josiah Crane had placed on a good man who simply wanted to farm his land in peace. Slowly, Henry closed the book. The rage that had been boiling in his blood shifted. It was no longer a blind, chaotic fury directed at the world. It was a cold, sharpened blade pointing directly west toward Denver. He looked up at Clara. She was watching him, expecting him to strike her, to cast her out into the blizzard. Instead, Henry walked over to the wooden table, set the ledger down gently, and then turned to the hearth. He picked up the heavy iron poker and stoked the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He killed my brother, Henry said quietly, his back to her. 10 years ago, burned our house, shot Thomas in the back, and bought the local sheriff so no charges were ever filed. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the broad, muscular back of the mountain man, finally understanding the profound, silent sorrow that seemed to emanate from him. They were two victims of the same predator. Crane had taken Henry's family, and he had taken Clara's life. I came up to these mountains to forget, Henry continued, turning to face her, to let the ice freeze out the memory. But a man can't outrun his ghosts. He pointed to the ledger. Who were you taking it to? Judge Isaac Parker in Telluride, Clara replied, her voice steadying. He is federal. Crane hasn't bought him. If Parker sees this ledger, he can authorize federal marshals to arrest Josiah. Henry nodded slowly. The blizzard raged outside, rattling the heavy oak door, but inside, a new, unbreakable pact had been forged in the firelight. Telluride is 60 miles through the highest passes in the San Juans, Henry said, his icy blue eyes locking onto hers. You'd never make it alone, not even in the summer. Then I will die trying, Clara said fiercely. No, Henry said, stepping forward, his massive presence suddenly feeling protective rather than threatening. You won't die, because I'm taking you there. The great white hurricane blew itself out on Sunday morning, leaving behind a landscape of terrifying, pristine beauty. The sky over Miller's Ridge cracked open, revealing a blinding, cloudless expanse of cobalt blue. The snow was 5 feet deep on the level, piled into monstrous 20-foot drifts against the tree lines. The temperature was 20 below zero, so cold that the sap in the pine trees froze and exploded with sounds like rifle shots. Inside the cabin, Henry was already moving. He packed the ledger securely at the bottom of his canvas satchel, wrapping it in oilcloth. "Eat everything you can," Henry commanded, handing Clara a tin plate piled high with heavily salted pan-fried venison and a thick slab of hardtack. "Your body is a furnace. In this cold, if you don't feed the fire, it goes out. Do not worry about being polite." Clara didn't argue. She ate with a newfound savage determination. She noticed that Henry was treating her differently today. There was no more gentle caution. He was treating her like a fellow soldier, a partner in a deadly campaign. The realization gave her a surge of unexpected confidence. Her size, which had always been a source of shame, was now the very insulation keeping her alive in a frozen hell. Henry strapped on his heavy gun belt, the familiar weight of the Colt revolver resting against his hip. He checked the action on his Sharps rifle, slipping a handful of massive .50-90 caliber brass cartridges into his coat pocket. "We leave in 10 minutes, Henry said. "We're going to put snowshoes on Barnaby. It will be slow going, but we need to make my cabin by nightfall. It's fortified, and I have enough provisions there to outfit us for the trek to Telluride." Clara nodded, wrapping the thick woolen scarves around her face until only her hazel eyes were visible. Henry pulled the heavy crossbar from the door and kicked it open. The sunlight reflecting off the snow was blinding. He stepped out onto the porch, his eyes squinting against the glare, scanning the pristine white expanse of the valley below. Suddenly, Barnaby, who was tethered in the antechamber, let out a sharp, distressed bray. Henry's instincts, honed by a decade in the wild, screamed a warning. He dropped to one knee just as the sharp crack of a Winchester repeater echoed across the ridge. A bullet slammed into the doorframe directly where Henry's head had been a fraction of a second prior, showering Clara with splinters of frozen oak. "Get down!" Henry roared, shoving Clara back inside the cabin and slamming the heavy door shut. He threw the crossbar back into place and scrambled toward the small frosted window facing the valley. He used the butt of his revolver to smash the icy glass, peering out through the jagged hole. Down in the tree line, about 200 yards away, the snow was moving. 3 figures, clad in heavy winter dusters and snowshoes, were advancing methodically up the slope. They were not mountain men. Their movements were too rigid, their gear too new. They were city killers, bounty hunters who had likely tracked Clara's stagecoach as far as Silverton before the storm hit and had waited out the blizzard in a lower line shack. "Josiah's men?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling as she crawled across the floorboards to crouch beside him. "Pinkertons are hired guns," Henry confirmed, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the leader. The man was tall, gaunt, and wore a distinctive bowler hat jammed down over a wool cap. "Harlan Briggs. He's a regulator from Denver. Crane must be paying him a fortune to trudge up here in this weather." "They want the book," Clara said, her hands flying to the canvas satchel on the floor. "They want you dead, Clara," Henry corrected grimly. "The book is just paper. You are the witness." From the tree line, Harlan Briggs cupped his hands around his mouth. His voice, thin and cruel, carried easily over the frozen, silent snow. "Halloway!" Briggs shouted. "We know you're in there. We tracked the fat cow's wagon to the base of the ridge. We don't have a quarrel with you, mountain man. Throw the woman and the ledger out the front door, and you can go back to eating pine cones. Keep her, and we'll burn you both out." Henry didn't answer. He smoothly fed a massive cartridge into the breech of his Sharps rifle, the metallic click sounding impossibly loud in the tense cabin. "Can we surrender?" Clara asked, her eyes wide with terror. "If I give them the book—" "Briggs doesn't leave witnesses," Henry said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "If you walk out that door, he'll put a bullet in your stomach and let you bleed out in the snow so he doesn't have to carry your body back. We fight." He positioned the heavy barrel of the rifle on the windowsill. "Briggs!" Henry roared back, his voice booming like thunder. "This is Miller's Ridge. You're out of your jurisdiction, and you're out of your depth." "Suit yourself, you wild animal!" Briggs yelled back. He signaled to his men. The 2 flanking gunmen raised their rifles and opened fire. The cabin erupted in chaos. Bullets tore through the rotting chinking, thudding into the heavy oak table and shattering the remaining crockery on the shelves. Clara screamed, pressing herself flat against the floor, covering her head. Henry didn't flinch. He let out a slow, controlled breath, tracking the gunman on the left who was foolishly standing upright to reload. Henry squeezed the trigger. The Sharp's rifle roared, spitting a massive cloud of white smoke into the room. The recoil slammed into Henry's shoulder. 200 yards away, the heavy lead slug hit the gunman square in the chest with the force of a runaway locomotive, throwing him backward into a snowdrift where he lay motionless. "One down," Henry muttered, immediately cracking the breech to reload. But Briggs was a seasoned killer. He and the remaining gunmen used the covering fire to sprint forward, diving behind the massive cord of dry firewood Henry had chopped days earlier. They were now within 50 yards. "They're too close," Henry said, the tactical situation deteriorating rapidly. "If they get to the blind side of the cabin, they'll pitch a kerosene lantern onto the roof. This old wood will go up like a matchstick." "What do we do?" Clara asked, her voice tight, but the panic subsiding. She was a woman who had survived Josiah Crane. She refused to die shivering on a floorboard. Henry looked at her, then at the heavy iron Dutch oven sitting by the fire. He looked at the powder horn hanging on the wall. A desperate, suicidal plan formed in his mind. "Clara," Henry said, locking eyes with her, "I need you to be brave. Braver than you've ever been in your life." The gunfire outside intensified. Splinters rained down on them as Briggs's Winchester systematically chewed through the front wall of the cabin. Henry grabbed his large powder horn. He unscrewed the cap and poured nearly a full pound of coarse black gunpowder into the heavy iron Dutch oven. He then grabbed a handful of iron nails he had used to fix the door, tossing them into the powder. "A bomb," Clara whispered, recognizing the lethal contraption. "Ha, a distraction," Henry corrected. He tore a strip of cotton from his own shirt, packing it into the spout of the Dutch oven lid as a fuse. He struck a lucifer match against the stone hearth. "Listen to me," Henry shouted over the deafening crack of rifle fire. "When I throw this out the window, it's going to blow. The moment it does, Briggs and his man will be deafened and blinded by the snow kicked up. That is our only window. We mount Barnaby, break through the back wall of the antechamber, and make for the tree line leading up to my cabin." Clara nodded. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She grabbed the satchel containing the ledger and slung it across her chest. Henry touched the match to the cotton fuse. It sparked and hissed, burning rapidly toward the heavy iron pot. "Get to the mule," Henry barked. Clara scrambled backward into the storage antechamber. Barnaby was stomping his hooves, terrified by the noise. Clara, using strength she didn't know she possessed, grabbed the mule's bridle, holding the heavy animal steady. Henry waited 3 agonizing seconds. Then, with a mighty heave, he hurled the heavy Dutch oven through the shattered window, sending it sailing through the crisp winter air toward the woodpile where Briggs was hiding. Henry didn't wait to watch it land. He sprinted into the antechamber just as the world outside erupted. The explosion was catastrophic. The heavy iron pot fragmented, sending lethal shrapnel tearing through the cord of wood. The blast wave shattered every remaining window in the cabin and sent a massive plume of white snow, dirt, and splintered pine soaring 50 feet into the air. "Now," Henry roared. He didn't bother opening a door. He took his heavy hunting axe and smashed the rotting frozen boards at the back of the lean-to. The wood gave way with a sickening crunch. Henry grabbed Barnaby's halter and lunged out into the blinding, swirling cloud of snow and smoke, pulling Clara behind him. They plunged into the waist-deep snow, moving toward the steep incline of the mountain. The snowshoes Henry had quickly strapped to the mule helped, but the animal still floundered. Behind them, through the settling smoke, coughing and swearing echoed. Briggs had survived the blast, likely shielded by the thick logs of the woodpile. "Halloway!" Briggs screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. Crack! A rifle shot rang out blindly through the smoke. Henry, who was aggressively pulling Barnaby up the steep grade, suddenly jerked forward. A sickening thud echoed, like a fist hitting a sack of wet grain. Henry gasped, his massive frame stumbling forward, plunging face first into the deep powder. "Henry!" Clara screamed. She waded through the snow to reach him. He was trying to push himself up, but his right arm refused to work. A blossoming stain of crimson was rapidly spreading across the shoulder of his bear hide coat. The bullet had caught him cleanly through the back of his right shoulder, missing the lung but shattering the collarbone. "Leave me," Henry gritted out, blood flecking his lips as he struggled to breathe through the shock. He shoved his Colt revolver toward her. "Take the mule, go up the ridge. My cabin is marked by 3 crossed pines. Go!" Shut up, Clara snapped. The wealthy, terrified socialite was gone. In her place was a woman forged by the unforgiving Rockies. She grabbed Henry by his good left arm. "Stand up." "I'm too heavy, Clara, and the snow." "I said stand up," she roared, her voice echoing off the canyon walls with a commanding authority that startled even the mule. Henry, fueled by sheer adrenaline and Clara's unrelenting grip, managed to get his feet under him. He was swaying, his face deathly pale beneath his beard. Clara didn't hesitate. She maneuvered Barnaby alongside him. She knew her own physical power. She was a large woman, heavily muscled beneath her layers of fat from years of carrying the psychological and physical weight of her miserable existence. She wrapped her thick arms around Henry's waist. With a guttural cry of pure exertion, Clara heaved upward, using her formidable mass as a counterweight to bodily lift the 6'3" mountain man, pushing him up and over the heavy western saddle. Henry groaned in agony as he slumped over the saddle horn, nearly passing out from the pain. "Hold on to the horn," Clara commanded, her chest heaving, sweat instantly freezing on her brow. Down below, the smoke was clearing. Briggs and his surviving man were stumbling out of the debris, looking up the slope. They spotted the tracks leading into the heavy timber. Clara grabbed Barnaby's halter. She didn't try to ride. The mule could never carry both of them up this grade. Instead, she became the engine. She plunged forward, using her wide, heavy frame to break a trail through the deep virgin powder, clearing a path for the heavily burdened mule. The cold bit into her lungs like shattered glass. Her legs burned with a fiery lactic acid, every step a Herculean effort against the crushing weight of the snow. But she didn't stop. She looked back over her shoulder. Henry was clinging to consciousness, his blood dripping steadily onto the white snow, leaving a gruesome trail for Briggs to follow. They breached the heavy timberline, plunging into the dark, shadowed world beneath the massive ancient pines. The snow was shallower here, protected by the canopy, but the incline was brutal. For 2 hours, Clara pulled. She dragged the mule and the dying man up the side of Miller's Ridge, fueled by a primal instinct to protect the first human being who had ever looked at her with respect. She heard the distant echoing shouts of Briggs and his man below. They were following the blood trail, but they were exhausted, slowed by the deep snow Clara had already brutalized her way through. Finally, as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long purple shadows across the ice, Clara saw it. 3 massive ponderosa pines, their trunks scarred with deep-crossed hatchet marks. Beyond them, tucked securely beneath a massive stone overhang that protected it from the worst of the elements, sat a stout, heavily fortified log cabin. Smoke was still rising faintly from the stone chimney. Clara dragged Barnaby the last 50 yards, her vision swimming with exhaustion. She reached the heavy door, threw the latch, and pushed it open. The inside was a haven, dry, warm, stacked high with provisions, animal traps, and heavy wool blankets. She turned and pulled Henry down from the saddle. He collapsed against her, dead weight. He had passed out a mile back. Clara dragged his massive frame inside, laying him on the heavy braided rug before the banked fire. She slammed the door shut, throwing the iron bolt, and turned back to the man bleeding out on the floor. She was no longer the outcast of Denver society. She was Clara Crane, the guardian of the ledger, and she was the only thing standing between the mountain man and the grave. She stripped off her heavy outer coat, grabbed a hunting knife from the table, and knelt beside him to cut away his bloody shirt. The true battle for survival had only just begun. The interior of Henry's cabin was a fortress of heavy timber, smelling of dried sage, cured leather, and wood smoke. But as Clara dragged Henry's massive, unresponsive frame onto the braided rug before the hearth, The overpowering copper scent of blood drowned out everything else. Henry's face was the color of dirty snow. His breathing was shallow, a wet, ragged rattle in his chest. Clara knew nothing of frontier medicine. Her entire life in Denver had been sanitized, attended to by expensive doctors who bled her with leeches to cure her melancholy. But as she knelt in the dirt and blood of the San Juan Mountains, instinct took over. She ripped the heavy bear-hide coat from his shoulders, taking her sharpest kitchen knife to his blood-soaked flannel shirt. The wound was horrific. The heavy-caliber bullet from Briggs's Winchester had entered through the back of Henry's right shoulder and exited just below his collarbone, shattering the bone and leaving a jagged, pulsing exit wound. He was bleeding out rapidly. "Stay with me," Clara ordered, her voice trembling but firm as she grabbed a clean canvas towel and pressed it brutally against the front of his shoulder. Henry groaned, his head thrashing side to side as consciousness briefly flared. His icy blue eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused with agony. "Clara, I have to stop the bleeding," she said, panic threatening to choke her. She looked around the cabin. There were bottles of whiskey, clean bandages, and a heavy iron poker resting in the glowing embers of the fire. Henry followed her gaze. Even in his delirium, the mountain man understood what had to be done. "The iron," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Do it." Clara's stomach heaved. "I can't. He's coming," Henry gasped, his left hand gripping her wrist with surprising, desperate strength. "Briggs is coming. If I die, he takes you. Burn it, Clara." Tears streamed down her dirt-streaked face, but the memory of Josiah Crane's sneering face, the man who had imprisoned her, who had sent these killers, hardened her resolve. She released the pressure on the wound, grabbed a bottle of raw rye whiskey, and poured a generous splash directly into the bullet hole. Henry roared, his massive body arching off the floor in pure agony. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth. Its tip was glowing a violent, angry cherry red. She straddled Henry's torso, using her immense weight to pin the thrashing, muscular giant to the floorboards. "Forgive me," she whispered, and pressed the glowing iron directly into the shredded flesh of his shoulder. The hiss of searing meat filled the cabin, accompanied by the acrid, nauseating smoke of burning blood. Henry let out a guttural, primal scream that shook the very rafters of the cabin before his eyes rolled back in his head and he mercifully passed out again. Clara held the iron there for 3 agonizing seconds until the bleeding stopped, sealing the ruptured vessels. She tossed the smoking iron aside and collapsed off his chest, sobbing violently as her adrenaline momentarily crashed. She quickly wrapped his shoulder tightly with clean linen bandages, securing his right arm to his chest to immobilize the shattered collarbone. She dragged a heavy wool blanket over him, feeling his forehead. He was cold, dangerously so, but the catastrophic bleeding had stopped. The sun had fully set now, plunging the mountain into a deep, freezing blackness. Clara stood up, wiping the sweat and tears from her face. She walked to the heavy oak door and dropped the second massive iron crossbar into place. She moved to the small, thick-glassed windows and pulled the heavy wooden shutters shut, bolting them from the inside. She was no longer running. She was making her stand. Clara picked up Henry's heavy Sharps rifle. She had watched him load it during the shootout at the old cabin. She cracked the breech, her hands shaking as she slid a massive A50-90 brass cartridge into the chamber, snapping it shut with a heavy metallic click. She then retrieved his Colt revolver, placing it on the heavy wooden table alongside the extra ammunition. For 2 hours, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and Henry's ragged breathing. Clara sat in a wooden rocking chair facing the door, the heavy rifle resting across her wide lap, the ledger sitting safely in her satchel at her feet. Then, she heard it. The unmistakable crunch of snowshoes outside. "Holloway," Harlan Briggs's voice called out. It lacked the arrogant volume it had earlier. The climb had exhausted him. "I know you're in there, bleeding like a stuck pig. My man saw the snow. You're done." Clara remained perfectly silent. "Send the woman out with the book, Holloway," Briggs yelled, his voice muffled by the thick logs. "Do that and I'll leave you to die in peace." From the floor, a low, gravelly voice broke the silence inside the cabin. Tell him to go to hell. Clara looked down. Henry was awake. He was deathly pale, sweating profusely from the shock and the pain, but his blue eyes were locked onto hers with a fierce, burning pride. I'll tell him myself, Clara whispered. She stood up, the heavy rifle in her hands, and walked toward the door. Mr. Briggs, Clara's voice rang out, strong and commanding, echoing through the heavy timber of the door. Outside, there was a pause. The hired killer was clearly not expecting the wealthy, disgraced socialite to answer. Mrs. Crane, Briggs sneered, I see the mountain man finally croaked. Listen to me, you stupid cow. Unbar that door and hand over Josiah's property, and I promise I'll make your death quick. Make me freeze out here, and I'll ensure it takes you a long, long time to die. My husband is a coward, and he hires cowards, Clara shouted back, her grip on the Sharp's rifle tightening until her knuckles turned white. You want the ledger, Mr. Briggs? Come in and take it. Suit yourself, Briggs hissed. A moment later, heavy footsteps crunched around the side of the cabin. Henry, struggling to prop himself up against the stone hearth with his good arm, hissed through his teeth. The roof! He sent his man to the roof! They're going to try and block the chimney, smoke us out! Clara looked up. The ceiling was made of thick, overlapping pine boards, but she could hear the scraping of boots against the icy shingles above the hearth. If they blocked the chimney, the smoke would fill the airtight cabin in minutes, suffocating them. Where? Clara asked, raising the heavy rifle. Just left of the flue, Henry rasped. Clara stepped back, leveling the massive buffalo rifle at the ceiling. She didn't have Henry's sharpshooting experience, but she understood physics. She aimed just to the left of the stone chimney, right where the scraping sound was loudest. She pulled the trigger. The recoil of the 50-90 cartridge was catastrophic. The butt of the rifle slammed into Clara's shoulder like the kick of a mule, knocking her flat on her back. The deafening roar of the gun filled the confined space, blowing a massive hole through the thick pine ceiling. A scream echoed from above, followed by the heavy, sickening thud of a body rolling down the pitch of the roof and plummeting into the deep snow outside. Good shot, Henry coughed, a grim smile touching his pale lips. But Clara didn't have time to recover. The deafening blast had masked Briggs's movements. With a tremendous splintering crash, the heavy wooden shutter on the window to Clara's right shattered inward. Briggs had used a heavy log to smash through the glass and the wood. Before Clara could scramble to her feet, Briggs thrust his Winchester rifle through the broken window, aiming blindly into the room. He fired twice. The bullets chewed into the wooden table and shattered a clay jug of water, showering Clara with icy shards. Briggs, realizing the crossbar was too thick to break, vaulted himself into the window frame, determined to breach the cabin. Clara's shoulder was screaming in pain from the rifle's recoil. The Sharp's was a single-shot weapon, and it was empty. Briggs was halfway through the window, his cruel, gaunt face illuminated by the firelight as he racked the lever of his Winchester, locking his eyes on her. Got you, you fat... He never finished the sentence. Clara did not cower, she did not scream. Channeling every ounce of rage, every year of humiliation, and the sheer, unadulterated mass of her body, she charged. Like a furious grizzly bear defending its den, Clara hit Briggs just as he raised his rifle. Her immense weight slammed into him with the force of an avalanche. The impact knocked the Winchester from his grip, pinning his upper body against the shattered, jagged wood of the window frame. Briggs gasped, the air completely driven from his lungs by the crushing impact of her body. He struggled frantically, drawing a long, wicked hunting knife from his belt, slashing blindly at her. The blade caught Clara's forearm, opening a deep gash, but she didn't even flinch. She grabbed Briggs by the collar of his heavy duster with both hands. With a roar of pure, primal fury, she yanked him fully into the room and threw him violently onto the floorboards. Briggs scrambled to get up, his eyes wide with sudden, absolute terror. He had vastly underestimated the physical power of the woman he had mocked. Clara didn't give him a chance to recover. She lunged for the wooden table, her bloodied hand wrapping around the grip of Henry's heavy Colt revolver. She spun around, cocking the hammer in one fluid motion. Briggs lunged at her with the knife. Clara fired point blank. The heavy .45 caliber bullet struck Briggs squarely in the chest. The force stopped him dead in his tracks. He stood frozen for a second, his cruel eyes wide with shock, staring at the woman who had just bested him. Then he crumpled backward, hitting the floorboards dead before his head even bounced against the wood. The cabin descended into a ringing, heavy silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Clara's ragged breathing. She stood over the dead killer, the smoking revolver still gripped tightly in her hand, blood dripping from the cut on her arm. She slowly turned to look at Henry. The mountain man was staring at her, utterly awestruck. "It's over," Clara whispered, dropping the gun onto the table. Her knees finally gave out and she sank to the floor, the adrenaline evaporating. Henry pushed himself up against the stones. He looked at the bodies, at the blood, and then at the incredible woman who had just fought a war for him. "You," Henry said, his voice thick with a profound, unshakable reverence, "are the most magnificent creature God ever put on this earth." They did not leave the cabin for 4 months. Winter in the San Juans locked them in, burying the world in 10 feet of impenetrable snow. For Clara and Henry, it was a season of healing, survival, and a profound, quiet transformation. Clara nursed Henry back from the brink of death. She boiled willow bark to manage his fever, cleaned his wound daily, and fed him the rich, fatty broths he needed to rebuild his shattered muscle. In turn, as Henry regained his mobility, he taught Clara the deep secrets of the mountains. He taught her how to tan hides, how to read the weather in the clouds, and how to shoot a revolver with lethal precision. Their physical proximity morphed into an emotional intimacy that neither had ever experienced. Stripped of society's cruel gaze and Josiah Crane's psychological torment, Clara blossomed. The relentless physical labor of chopping wood, hauling water, and surviving the brutal cold hardened her heavily muscled frame. She remained a woman of immense size, but she no longer viewed it as a curse. It was the very armor that had saved her life. Henry, who had spent 10 years running from the ghost of his murdered brother, found his peace. He didn't look at Clara with pity. He looked at her with a burning, fierce devotion. In the quiet hours of the night, wrapped together beneath heavy bear hides, they shared their deepest traumas, mending the fractured pieces of each other's souls. By late April, the great thaw finally arrived. The snowpacks melted, turning the mountain streams into roaring rapids of white water. It was time to finish the war. They packed the mules and began the treacherous 50-mile trek through the high passes toward the town of Telluride. Clara rode tall in the saddle, her hazel eyes sharp and clear, wrapped in the furs she had cured herself. Henry rode beside her, his right arm fully functional again, his Sharps rifle resting across his lap. Upon arriving in Telluride, they bypassed the local sheriff and walked directly into the federal courthouse, seeking the chambers of the notoriously incorruptible Judge Isaac Parker. When Clara dropped Josiah Crane's leather-bound ledger onto the judge's mahogany desk, the air in the room shifted. "My name is Clara Crane," she announced, her voice unwavering. "This book contains the financial records of my husband, Josiah Crane. Inside, you will find proof of bribery, extortion, land theft, and the funding of murder for hire, including the murder of Thomas Halloway in Kansas." Judge Parker, a stern man with a thick mustache, opened the ledger. As his eyes scanned the meticulous columns of red ink, his face paled. It was the absolute, undeniable key to dismantling the most corrupt railroad empire in the West. "Mrs. Crane," Judge Parker said slowly, looking up at her with profound respect, "do you understand the danger you have placed yourself in? If Crane learns you are alive—" "He already tried to kill me, Your Honor," Clara replied, glancing at Henry, who stood like a silent, lethal sentinel by the door. "He sent Harlan Briggs and 2 regulators. They are currently buried under the spring thaw on Miller's Ridge." The judge's eyebrows shot up. Harlan Briggs was a known terror in the territory. To hear that this woman and a solitary mountain man had dispatched his crew was nothing short of miraculous. "I will dispatch U.S. Marshals via the telegraph immediately," Judge Parker declared, slamming the ledger shut. "Josiah Crane will not see another sunset as a free man." The hammer of federal justice fell with terrifying speed. 3 days later, a contingent of 20 heavily armed U.S. Marshals raided Josiah Crane's palatial estate in Cherry Creek, Denver. Crane, arrogant to the last, attempted to flee with a satchel of embezzled cash, but was cornered in his own opulent stables. He surrendered, weeping like a coward as the irons were slapped onto his wrists. The ensuing trial was the spectacle of the century. The ledger provided insurmountable evidence. Josiah Crane was stripped of his assets, his empire dismantled, and he was sentenced to life in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth. Because of Josiah's conviction, his fraudulent acquisition of Henry Higgins's shipping fortune was voided. The federal courts reinstated Clara as the sole rightful heir to her father's immense estate. Overnight, the ridiculed, outcast Higgins Mountain became one of the wealthiest women in Colorado. But Clara had no desire to return to the gilded cages of Denver society. She liquidated the shipping company and the Cherry Creek mansion. With her vast fortune, she purchased 10,000 acres of pristine, untouched wilderness in the San Juan Mountains, encompassing Miller's Ridge and the valleys below. She and Henry did not build a mansion. They built a sprawling, magnificent log ranch house, designed to withstand the brutal winters, nestled beneath the shadows of the very peaks that had forged their bond. They were married in the late autumn, under a canopy of golden aspen leaves. There were no high society guests, no opulent gowns, just the local townsfolk from Silverton, who had come to deeply respect the formidable woman and the quiet giant who tamed the high country. Clara and Henry Halloway lived a long, prosperous life, eventually filling their sprawling ranch with children who learned to revere the wild. Clara never lost her imposing stature, but the town whispers changed. They no longer spoke of her with mockery. They spoke of her with awe, the woman who had broken a railroad baron, outgunned a crew of killers, and captured the heart of the fiercest mountain man in the Rockies. The mountains had not broken them. The mountains had merely burned away the fragile facades of the civilized world, revealing the unbreakable iron beneath. What an incredible tale of survival, strength, and ultimate justice. Clara's journey from a trapped, ridiculed outcast to a fierce protector and wealthy frontier queen proves that true power comes from within, no matter what society says. Henry and Clara's unbreakable bond forged in the freezing Rockies is the ultimate Wild West romance. Did Clara's bravery against the ruthless bounty hunters leave you speechless? Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below. If you loved this story, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling real-life wilderness tales.